Welcome to Agile to Agility podcast with Miljan, Bajic.
Major show alert!
The very first value we wrote is individuals and interactions.
Let's take this another level.
Everything needs a catalyst or a trigger point. I think COVID has triggered the shift from systems thinking to complexity thinking. And you can see that starting to work.
Dave, how has COVID-19 impacted you? In what ways, and have you changed what you do, how you see things? Isn't this what we needed as society, maybe?
That's a very big question. I mean, personally, I've never been in one place for this long since I was really at university, right? So yeah. I was traveling over 250 days a week a year in hotels, and now I haven't traveled for over a year. So that's different. From the point of view of what we work on, it's kind of like, it's almost like our time has come because we work on complexity and uncertainty. And nobody's really denied that that's now important. So the big thing which happened a week ago, which is going to be formally launched in April, is the joint handbook or field guide on how to manage in complexity and crisis, which we jointly published with the EU Commission. So that's big, right?
Right.
And we're currently building assessment processes and follow-through processes around that with a series of partners. So I think from that point of view, it's everything needs a catalyst or a trigger point. I think COVID has triggered the shift from systems thinking to complexity thinking. And you can see that starting to work, all right, or at least a non-causal or uncertainty. From a society point of view, I think it's a wake-up call. It's not the worst plague we'll see in my lifetime, and I'm about to be 67. And it's not the worst thing which is going to happen, right? So I think if we can't get it right around this, then we really are up shit creek, as they say. Yeah. And I think it's also challenged some of the orthodoxies. So the whole rationing basis of money within neoliberalism has just been destroyed by COVID. So what comes out of that is going to be really interesting.
But isn't it like, I don't know what your thoughts are so far on the response, but the response general across the world has been pretty bad. Like, so maybe this is the learning experience, but what are your thoughts? How did we respond to these crises as a society?
It's been bad and good. First of all, the sheer number of things which government or society should possibly plan for is beyond our capacity to handle. So it's all very well with the benefit of hindsight to say we should have done more on pandemic management, but to be quite honest, we couldn't afford to do it. Not if you add in all the other things which might have hit simultaneously. It's just this one hit, right? Now, I think there were governments who managed it very well, like New Zealand, for example, partly because they did. This is a key part of the EU field guide. It's the role of a leader is actually not to make decisions in a crisis. It's to coordinate other people making decisions, except for the early decisions where you have to make some fairly drastic stuff to create options for the future, which is what the New Zealand Prime Minister did. She actually broke the law to lockdown, but she realized it was necessary. The people who really failed were the big populist governments, I think, like the UK and the US and Brazil. And they failed because the realities of the condition didn't match the myth they were spreading. So if you live a populist myth, then the world, all three leaders were in varying degrees of narcissism, then they tried to ignore it for a long time. I mean, our Prime Minister went around shaking people's hands to prove it wasn't an issue. And we won't talk about the US president or the Brazilian president, who, kind of like up in the same category. So I think it was mixed. I think actually, as a species, we muddled through a lot better than could have been predicted. People accepted lockdowns without riots on the street far more than we thought. And we managed to do what's a type of bricolage or radical repurposing. We managed to kind of like get through in some countries without people dying outside hospitals unable to be admitted. Now, it hasn't happened in others, but so it's a mixed package. So I think there's a lot of learning out of this. But I don't think it's a disaster. I think we actually did better than anybody could have predicted. And the vaccine development, in fact, we got 5 working vaccines when you would normally expect you'd be lucky to get one.
Yeah.
I think indicates the speed of development of science and the ability of science to provide solutions where you create connections. And if you want one really good thing which came out of COVID, I think, it's kind of like made people respect scientists a bit more. I mean, the populist thing was denying the value of science, and kind of like that's a lot more difficult to do at the moment if we ignore anti-vaxxers and anti-maskers and all these people. But,
is that a paradigm shift? And maybe to just quote you, one of the things that I reached out to that stood out to me, you posted on Twitter a couple of maybe weeks ago, maybe a little bit longer. I'll quote you here, and I want to hear your thoughts on this. You said a problem for people who have invested their whole career in a particular discipline or paradigm is that when the world turns, they can't accept things have changed.
yeah.
Can you elaborate a little bit on that?
Yeah, that I was hitting about 5 separate targets with that, 4 of whom realized they were being attacked. So that was quite cool, really. One of whom still hasn't, so that's even more entertaining. I think it goes back in with something, 2 really important bits of the sort of theory behind what we do, naturalizing sense making. One is people only observe 3 or 4% of what's in front of them at any one time, and they match it against previous patterns. So we do a first fit pattern match. So actually, it's very difficult to see novelty. You're not expecting to see it, so you won't unless your attention is drawn to it. And at a society level, if we ignore the total nonsense of things like memes, what you actually have is what are called tropes or assemblages. So you have patterns of narrative that people live in that they find difficult to escape from. So I don't find this particularly surprising, right? So we know that's just 101 neuroscience or cognitive neuroscience. So we should expect that to be the problem.
What are your thoughts? I know in the past you've commented on this, but just on cognitive development, psychology, and specifically on spiral dynamics or any of those popular cognitive development frameworks, or maybe just share your thoughts on what you think is going on in the context of cognitive development and paradigms.
Yeah, you're lumping an awful lot of stuff together there. So let's just run through it at a high level. All right.
So how about so maybe you choose how you want to respond. My question is really about what is your take on adult cognitive development or development stages? What are your thoughts on that?
I think most of these things can be useful at an individual level, but they don't apply to organizations. And I think there are major issues on trying to bring psychotherapeutic techniques sideways into organizational design. Because anything you bring sideways from therapy assumes that somebody needs therapy and privileges a therapist, right? So, for example, if you take Keegan's models of adult maturity, I would use that in leadership, but not as a linear progression, but as a series of separate modulators. And you can oscillate between them. It's not a linear process. It's a non-linear influence. And there you can find Keegan's stuff quite useful. At the other end of the extreme, you've got things which are established pseudosciences like Myers-Briggs, which has no basis whatsoever in any science. It's actually established as a pseudoscience. And then you get things like the spiral dynamics nonsense. Now, if you go back to the original research on that with Graves, that's been invalidated because he only researched his own students without proper control. So it doesn't count. And you can't take a culturally specific and very culturally determined framework and apply it to the rest of the world. And you certainly can't take it and apply it to New Age mysticism and cultism, which is what Beck did with Wilbur. And you can see how absurd it is because they decided they had to add turquoise to it. So they had a heightened state of alignment. And now somebody else has added jade because they want an even another heightened state of alignment. I mean, this stuff is just farcical nonsense and amazed anybody takes it seriously.
Right. You mentioned Myers-Briggs and those and those are huge money makers. A lot of companies that go in use it. You have your thoughts on McKinsey, I've seen, and other consulting companies that when it comes to organizational consulting and that type of things. How much have these big companies diluted or strayed leaders in
I think
in
substantially. And if you look at the origins of Myers-Briggs, it was two people who were well-intentioned trying to create a general framework. They thought it was based on Jung, but the argument is actually Jung actually denied it when he sought validity. But I wouldn't go with Jungian or Freudianism anyway. I mean, it was a cute idea in the 19th century. We've grown out of it. But what then happened is Hay came along and generalized it, and they decided to go along with the compromise. Now, that you won't find a psychology department in the universe who takes it seriously. Yeah, because it's got no research base. It operates the same way that astrology works. It says things in such a way that you self-identify and give it authority, and that's a known problem with human perception. So I think, you know, there are other ones which work better. I sometimes work with, say, the original 7 characteristic Belbin one, because it doesn't make the mistake of saying that people are predetermined, right? It says, dependent on the context, you'll shift between roles, which is much more accurate. And I think you have to look at when Myers-Briggs came in. It came in just when we were switching over to an engineering paradigm with things like business process re-engineering. And HR departments wanted to treat their employees as widgets on the shelf, so they wanted to categorize them. And Myers-Briggs came along and it did that.
Yeah. So it's essentially what we're looking for. And you recently also said Canadian is not about creating recipes, but about facilitating chefs. How much? I mean, like, we have such a desire for recipes. Like, you know, I talked about recently about how Scrum is a recipe as well. And a lot of these are things, these companies are delivering what we want, right? There's a demand for it. So what are your thoughts on, in general, how much we're seeking
There's
those
nothing
recipes?
wrong with a recipe. I mean, when I learned to cook at university, I had recipe books. And I followed the recipe. But then I acquired skill and I didn't need to follow it anymore, and I had higher adaptation. So this is not a right or wrong thing, but the problem is, I mean, I can talk about something we're doing in a second on this. So the problem is that each context has a high degree of uniqueness about it. So the minute you have a linear process and a linear recipe, you're automatically going to miss weak signals. So if you take, you know, so one of the things we're doing at the moment, for example, is to create not only our methods and tools, but other people's methods and tools as the sort of facilitation kit, which allows people to produce different things in different combinations in context. Is much more what the chef does, right? So the chef says, well, I haven't got sugar, so I'll use honey. It's that ability to substitute and move things around. So you can take Scrum, for example, which is one of the most powerful software development method sets I've seen. It's not a framework, it's a set of methods for making complex things complicated, and that's its huge power. But there's no reason why I shouldn't break it down a bit and say, well, let's take out the sprint and replace it with a 3-month time box. And that's the sort of way we're working at the moment, is to look at what's the lowest level of optimal granularity of our methods and other people's methods, and then look at how you can combine and recombine those to give contextually appropriate solutions. So that's kind of like a halfway house between the gifted chef and the gifted recipe user. It uses artifacts to create some structure. And to my mind, that's key because, and it's what we're doing around the EU field guide. So we're creating an assessment process, which starts off by recognizing that you probably did a lot of things right, rather than here's a process you now have to follow. It says, let's work out what you did right and what won't scale and what you did wrong. And then from that, create a unique pathway, right? And which is contextually appropriate.
But that means that you have to be willing to be a chef. Like, chefs know at the core, at the chemical level, how ingredients interact with each other, right?
You can mix it. I mean, you don't have to be, I mean, a real chef will serve probably about a 10 or 15 year apprenticeship. Yeah. And this is what Aristotle called Sophia and Pronesis. So they have Pronesis knowledge in their fingertips, and they have a theoretical knowledge, but the theoretical knowledge is so ingrained in what they do every day, they don't have to summon it explicitly, right? Equally, the recipe book user is just saying, well, I need all of these ingredients and I need all of this equipment, and then I'll follow the recipe. There is actually several stages in between that, one, and this is where modularity comes in, or granularity as we call it, right? So I can actually identify, and what's interesting, I've gone back to my old object-oriented textbooks from the 90s on this. You can actually, if you get the granularity right, you've got polymorphism and inheritance, and you've got input-output. So if you can get that definition right, then people can assemble things knowing what the output has to be for an input somewhere else. And you can give them a lot of the capability of the chef without them needing to go through that process, but you avoid the non-linear recipe. And one of the reasons why a few weeks ago we put all of our methods into open source in a wiki, which we've now got several hundred people involved in, which is hugely encouraging, is basically to say the field needs to expand quickly, and we need to get this modularity into the space in open source, because too much of Agile gets locked behind proprietary walls. Yeah. One of the great success that Ken did with Scrum when he launched it is Scrum was open source. So you tended to go to him for the methods and training. Whereas SAFe is a lockdown, and then you get, you know, some of the really crazy stuff. I mean, you've got this Agile 2 nonsense coming out now, which is just hysterically funny, because they're trying desperately to say they're not going to create an accreditation scheme, but we all know that's what they're doing, right? Yeah, they're going down a well-worn pathway. And I think it was interesting, because I was one of the 3 founders of DSDM when it started, which was one of the big, and that was one of the big things which went into Agile. So Agile is mainly XP, Scrum, and DSDM. And DSDM was formed when 3 of us met at a pub in Cheltenham for a meal, because we're British, so we can do things over a pub meal. We don't have to go to a ski resort for a week, all right? But the critical thing was we set up DSDM, which is now called something else, I think, effectively between 3 competitors. So 3 competitors met and agreed to create an independent standard. We didn't try and lock it down and make it proprietary, which is, and I think that was one of the really big mistakes the Agile movement made. And even Scrum has now made it. I mean, the legal suits flying around in the Scrum community at the moment, you know, would be amusing if it wasn't for their negative impact on the field.
So, no, I completely, I mean, I share the same thoughts. And one of the things that kind of inspired me, you and Andrea did the talk back in 2019, I believe, Agile to Agility. And as you can see, that's the name of my podcast. It wasn't the thing that triggered it, but when I saw that you guys did it too, I was like, this resonated with me.
I could trademark that one, yeah.
I thought you guys had, I got the agile to agility.com, and it expired, or somehow I ended up. But what do you think is, for the last 20 years, there's been so much focus on big A and agile and tools and these. What do you think are the next 5 to 10 years? Like, when it comes to agility and focusing to agility, yeah.
Agile as a movement is coming to the end of its life cycle. It's had 20 years, all right? And if you want the indications of why, you can see the commoditization of SAFe and the fact that PMI didn't have the guts to take it on, but are trying to imitate it, all right? And that's a mistake, all right? The other thing is that the fact that the big consultancies have all adopted it. So they bought Agile brand companies at ridiculous P ratios just to get into a market. Now, if you've been around long enough, and if you know enough about the theory of market life cycles, that means the market's entering its commoditization stage, which means that's the time when you introduce new things, because the market's stale. Now, you don't do that by trying to be romantic about the past, or trying to create your own new special thing. And to be quite honest, Dean with SAFe moved into that field before anybody else, and he owns it now. I mean, it was unscrupulous. It was sold off a pyramid selling scheme. He's now trying to introduce quality, but that's to stop other people doing what he did to get it established in the first place. And yeah, fine, all right. That the point is that always happens, and it happens about that life cycle. Now, what the new thing is, I think, is open. If you want my view on it, I think first of all, most software development has followed the sort of engineering metaphor that underpins systems thinking. And it uses manufacturing metaphors in the main, in terms of the way it thinks. Now, complexity takes organic metaphor, So for example, if I look at some of the work we're doing at the moment, we're looking at mapping existing capabilities against unarticulated needs. Now that's a complete switch away from traditional procurement and software design, but actually it allows you to progress faster, quicker. Yeah. We're looking at architectural issues in which, as I said back in the 80s, but nobody listened to me then, yeah, people are objects too. So organizations and people and identities are objects. They have input output, they interact with technology. If you architect the system properly, then radical innovations will emerge through those interactions. And I think that's the really important lesson of complexity. It's not about things, it's about how they interact. And if you change the interactions, then radical change happens. If you try and change things, nothing changes.
So it's really about designing the systems and designing influencing the system and designing.
It's designing the architecture. So for example, we've developed a whole typology of what's called scaffolding. So for example, do you have an endoskeleton or an exoskeleton? If you have an exoskeleton, the thing is contained, you know what it will look like. Yeah. If you have an endoskeleton, then you have a coherent structure, but a huge amount of variety can develop very quickly. And the issue is to make choices like that, right? And this goes way beyond things like perpetual alpha or perpetual beta as well. If you can stabilize your objects, whether they're people objects or software objects, then and allow the interactions to determine what the system as a whole looks like, you're effectively allowing things to grow or evolve rather than trying to define in advance what they should be. And that means you create far more resilience. And if you look at it, that's actually where the internet has developed. You know, things like hashtags suddenly became ways that you connect different things, right? And nobody designed that, it just kind of like happened, right? And I could go through other examples. You know, the key thing there was the creation of open standards. You know, so the fact that all of these, and that again, open standards are interaction protocols. So if you can create a common understood interaction protocol, all sorts of exciting things can evolve.
That's really interesting. So if coming back to the topic of what's next, or what's what's the next wave, or maybe even paradigm gonna be, it's really focusing on that like complexity management, living systems, and really trying to understand how patterns maybe work. Would you say that?
Yes, no, you need to be careful because then people dive you into Alexandrian pattern language. And again, that was insightful, but it's not where we're coming from. And I think if you look what happens in the 80s, systems thinking, which is popularized as systems dynamics and cybernetics, comes along. Yeah. And it's considered highly academic and esoteric 1 year, and then 3 years later, it just dominates the world through business process re-engineering, through learning organization. And we've had a whole series of micro patterns within that. You know, BPR, Six Sigma, Agile is one of those at the moment. Yeah, it's going through exactly, you know, blue ocean strategy. I could go through a whole bunch of these. Yeah, none of that. They're all kind of like, this is that they all have this character, and this has been a characteristic post scientific management. Never did this. It never made that mistake. Systems thinking did. It assumed there was a solution to fit them all. You know, one solution to you know bind them in the darkness, to go back to Tolkien, right? And therefore, when the solution fails, as it's bound to, so business process re-engineering evolved in manufacturing where it works. It was then moved into services where it's a disaster.
Exactly.
Yeah. And so then people come along with something new to replace it, and then that doesn't work. So this attempt to create universals rather than context specific is fundamentally characteristic of systems thinking and the engineering metaphor. Yeah? And with that goes things like corporate objectives, mission statements, purpose statements, management by object, all of those sort of things. You don't see any of them in the scientific management era. They're all a product of the post-80s. So I think what COVID is triggering is the switch from engineering to ecology is a major paradigm shift, and then there'll be cycles within that. And during the major paradigm shift, all you can do is try and influence it, which is one of the reasons we went open source. Yeah, because you can't deter. So to give my favorite example on this at the moment, somebody told me the other day I had to go and watch Frozen 2. Now, my daughter is in her 30s and thinks I don't understand Deleuzian epistemology. And I haven't got grandchildren yet, so I've got no excuse to watch Frozen 2. So I sort of covertly went into the sitting room on my own and watched it. And it's actually quite a good movie. And the reason they said I should watch it is there's a key phrase in Frozen 2, which is do the next right thing. And that actually is kind of like the key principle of complexity. You can't know the future, but you can move to the adjacent possible. And you can choose where you move next and stay open to possibilities as you go forward. And I think that's where we are at the moment. And to be honest, on a major paradigm shift, success will go to those people who work across boundaries rather than those people who try and create boundaries. Because if you try and create boundaries, you can't move fast enough. And given an illustration, we went open source on the wiki, right? Now, open source means anybody can use it. But we've done more in 2 weeks than we've done the previous 2 years when it was internal, because you're bringing a greater amount of people to bear, right? And the whole strategy at the moment is to open up boundaries, not to close them down. And by the way, I think the other really big thing is to avoid platitudes. If I could say the worst thing I've seen in my career from the 80s onwards is the constant desire to write wonderful words on flip charts and then call them mission statements or purpose statements or objectives. And if you do an analysis on it, they all use the same rough, small number of words and recombine them, right?
And nobody can recite them, or they just know that they
nobody
exist.
Can remember them. And the other thing is that they're actually bad anthropology. If you look at all the major world religions, none of them use that mechanism. They all teach through parables. Now, we're actually launching a parable project next month. It's part of our Numinous project, where every quarter we'll present a new parable from a different religion and get people to say what it means for them in their current role and where they're going to go. So we're starting off with the parable of the sower. We're moving on to a Sufi story of the Mullah Nasruddin, and then we're moving on to Whale Rider, which is a wonderful Maori film. And the point about parables is they give you a sense of direction without being absolute, and they can't be gamed. Anybody can game a purpose statement. It's fascinating the way purpose took off. So if you look at it, there's nothing different in purpose from mission statements. It's exactly the same thing. But somebody realizes as a market edge, they publish a best-selling book with lots of retrospective case studies. They give it a capital letter instead of a small letter, and they dine out on the speaker fees. And the big consultancies pick it up because every 3 years they want you to redo everything, so you can have a large team of what I call semi-house trained polecats at $5,000 a day working for you. And it's a whole industry now, and it's actually quite dangerous.
Do you think that is going to continue? Because it's been like that for a long time.
No, I think the big consultancies rose on the back of business process reengineering. Before that, consultancies were small groups of experienced people with a very low ratio between partnership and consultant. What then happened is consultancy became industrialized because business process reengineering created a market for large teams of people doing analytical work. And the business schools actually grew up to serve that. I mean, people get this. The business schools and the big consultancies are a 30-year-old phenomenon. And their entire model is these large-scale change programs. So I don't think that will survive. I think we're talking about alliances of small specialists in the future rather than the sort of big generalists.
And if you, at least when I look at it, and I don't know from your perspective, but a lot of these change initiatives that you just mentioned, a lot of these transformations, what we call even agile transformations, like most of them, 90 in my opinion, plus fail. They actually never worked.
Well, not only that, they've consistently failed for 30 years, but people keep thinking if they do it again this time, it will work. I mean, it's kind of like really rather stupid, all right? But the point is, and the other problem is actually one of the things that SAFE sold off. So SAFE sold off three things. It's a good illustration. One is the huge desire of Agile people to have something they could train people in, because training revenue is high margin. So it starts off, do the 5-day course, you can then do the 4-day course, provided you pay me a royalty. And that was the pyramid selling scheme. Secondly, the desire of executives to say they're doing something which they're not doing in practice. And the SAFE diagram allowed them to say they were being agile, but have this huge bloody waterfall engineering diagram to deal with. But the really cynical bit is what executives really want, if they're cynical and there's enough of them around, is a major program which will take 3 years to implement and cost several $1 million. Because then they get all the kudos from having initiated it, but they move on before the consequences are known. And that's become a very scary pattern. And it's partly the short-termism of executive employment. I'll give an illustration. When I was first a general manager, right, so this is back in the 80s, I had to do a year in production, a year in support, and a year in sales and hit my targets. Until I'd done that, I wasn't even eligible to become a general manager, because if you haven't, and people should do this, if you haven't not known whether you can pay your mortgage or not because you haven't made a sale, until you've lived that, you do not understand salespeople. And if you're on a support line, you know that it's not how long a call takes on average by the number of calls divided by the number of people. It just doesn't work like that, right? So that tacit knowledge was key. And then we expected, if you were in a general management role, you had to legally commit to be in it for at least 3 years. You couldn't leave, right? Because 3 years, you can't run out fast on the consequences of your decisions. Right? Now you get somebody, they'll often get parachuted into a general management or a CEO role, having done a BA in business studies, an MBA, and been a consultant and never got any real experience. And they end up trying to run a company. And of course, the only way they can do it is through spreadsheets.
Or they bring somebody else, like a big consulting company, to actually.
Yeah, the one who originally employed them. And some of them actually do that. They push people out if they can't make partner, but they push them into industry and then they create an obligation.
Yeah. So you mentioned SAFE, and pretty much all of the agile scaling frameworks, in my opinion, are unsuccessful, right? So like there's something about agile community that, and even Scrum, like you said, it's a great framework, but it's a team level, and it's trying to almost like tame, like you said, things from complex to complicated, and that doesn't work always either, as great as a framework it is. But if we come back to scaling, I really want to just, or maybe just hear your thought first on scaling, and why did the agile community, why do we keep getting it wrong with the scaling?
Because we think we don't understand the basic science of it. So you don't scale a complex adaptive system, and it is a complex system, by aggregation or imitation or combination. That doesn't work. You scale it by decomposition and reinteraction. So you actually break it into smaller components, and then you allow those components to interact in different ways. And if you think about it, the whole of organic life form comes from 4 chemicals in different combinations. So this can be here, that's DNA, right? But they didn't do that. So they held things. So if you look at SAFE, right, the way SAFE is, anything anybody wants to buy, Dean puts on the diagram and sells you a certificate in. Just added design thinking to it. So the granularity is wrong, right? So say, if you look at Scrum, the granularity is things like sprint, retrospective. If you get that granularity, you can substitute. So we've developed 3 pre-Scrum techniques for agile communities. Because they deal with things which are truly complex, whereas Scrum deals with things which are still complex but can now be made complicated.
Exactly.
And for some reason, the Agile community has completely got rid of time boxes, which were a major feature of DSDM and were hugely valuable. So you have a minimal viable product, a maximum product, a minimum level of resource, a maximum, and you promise to deliver on the date. But Agile got itself hung on this fact: nobody can hold us to a delivery date. And that's a bloody nightmare if you're an executive or you're managing a large project. The time box method said you knew on this date you would at least get this functionality for this cost, then you might get something else. Now, as I say, you can start to do clever things with Scrum if you start to, for example, take a sprint and make it a time box. And intersect retrospectives in different ways. And I think that's where we're going to go in future. It's a multi-methods, multi-vendor approach. And the key thing will be understand the interaction between methods, and that will be unique in context. So if you look at the SAFE diagram, they can't even fit their linear model on one line now. It's sort of snakes in a big S shape, right? And as you start here, you go through here. By the time you get here, you spent about $5 million, and you can't go back.
Yeah. So is it really about, it's about time boxing, but it's also delivering within those time boxing, because you can time box things, but not deliver anything.
Yeah, but that was the contract. So as a team, you contracted to deliver at least the minimal viable product for the maximum resource. So you could vary what you delivered and you could vary the resource, but you had to deliver at least this on that date. Yeah. That actually works quite well because it's event driven. Yeah. And I've managed software and I've been a software developer, right? If you allow software developers, you don't put fire under their feet on a time-based delivery, they never get around to delivering anyway. I mean, the only way I've managed software teams all my life is to have a client screaming and making sure the software development teams get the grief so I'm not feeling from it. Then magically they produce things, all right? Or they make necessary compromises. So I think I'm not arguing that time boxes are the solution, but I'm saying they're part of the solution. So Scrum is a key part of the solution as a collection of methods, but not as a framework. Kanban is a very useful technique, right? Time box is a useful technique. XP has got a whole body of stuff that everybody's forgotten about. The trouble is,
I was going to say about that, because that's one of the things that people say, like, oh, let's do Scrum, but they completely, like, when you look at their architecture, when you look at the technical practices, they're not.
Yeah, but remember the problem here, right? Something if Agile had been built on the back of XP, none of us would be talking about it now. What Ken did was codification and abstraction. That's what Scrum was. So because Scrum was codified and abstract, it could actually diffuse very quickly. This is quoting Brasser's work. XP doesn't diffuse because it's not codified and it's not abstract, and it requires high expertise. So as I famously said at Lean Agile Scotland, I remember saying this, all right? That was when I also upset David because I said Kanban was a complicated technique, not complex. And sort of flurry of tweets come in from our founder on the sideline. So I remember saying that, if Agile had scaled around XP, it would be much more exciting. But than if Scrum, and all the XP cheered me, so I thought, I can't have this. I said, the problem is that nobody in XP can talk to ordinary mortals, so there was no chance it would ever scale. And they're still trying to work out whether that was an insult or not. They haven't made up their minds yet, right?
Yeah, I think, Ken, I mean, if I look back and the Agile Manifesto and what they did really did set the foundation, but without Ken, I think in his wouldn't have been where we are. Well, you recently published or were part of the Complex 21 Trends SenseMaker report. What was the most interesting thing that you got out of that report?
You'd have to ask the team. I wasn't involved in that.
Did you review it? No.
No, we split Cognitive Edge into two: a commercial wing, they did that work, and the Nevin Center, which is the research not-for-profit government group which I run. So that was done in the commercial side. I think they published stuff and they ran a webinar the other day, but I wasn't involved in it.
Okay. I saw you recently, and this is more of a fun, it got me curious, and I don't know really what you meant about it, but it's you tweeted about having wine, rum, and whiskey in the same day, and you said it's that type of day. What kind of the day requires wine, rum, and whiskey?
When I get onto rum and dark, then I'm in a very dark mood. It was a bad day. Too much time with lawyers, too much time with people I trusted not being trustworthy, and too much time with doing 18-hour days. And those hit you from time to time. I'm probably better able to cope with them than 20-year-olds because I've been through too many in my life. And to be honest, Twitter's a great, I get into trouble for it from time to time. I regard social media as a wonderful way of letting rip at something. It gets it off your system. And if people, it's amazing how many you tweet something targeted at somebody and you get all these emails from people that you don't mean me, did you? And you think, well, actually I didn't, but if the cat fits, wear it. All right. So it's,
That's what happens. Yeah. When you have a following. So, another thing that kind of stood out to me when I was looking about the questions to ask you is you said the single most fundamental error of the last 3 decades is to try and design an idealized future state rather than working the evolutionary potential of the here and now. And you alluded to this earlier in our conversation, but could you maybe elaborate, like, the biggest thing in the last 3 decades? That's a pretty big statement.
It is. What's interesting is it's fairly recent, and it's got the highest volume reposting of anything I've ever done anywhere on social media. So it kind of like obviously, struck a bell, all right, as they say. I wrote a blog post on this in more detail. But the problem is what came in, and I think this is whether you call it systems thinking or systems dynamics or cybernetics or some other name, but it's let's summarize that as the engineering metaphor, which came in the 80s.
Mm-hmm.
And the way that you handle uncertainty, and Sengi was one of the first to do this, all right, was to say, well, the way we'll handle uncertainty is all too difficult. So we'll decide where we want to be, and then people can close the gap. And that gave rise to the whole mission statement, value statement, future. And thereafter, every time somebody wants to do something, all the executives sit down and decide where they want to be. And then they try and close the gap. And of course, they never achieve it because it's a complex system and you can only ever know the next right step, right? Mm-hmm. So in complexity, you describe the present, you identify where you can move. So you start journeys with a sense of direction. You don't have goals because goals mean you focus on goal achievement and you miss opportunities you'd find on the journey. And if you look at every single method or every single approach which has come out since the 80s, it always starts with the leaders sitting down and deciding where they want to be. Yeah. And it hasn't worked in 3 decades, so maybe it's time to stop.
But and maybe that's kind of part of the fundamental of complexity and complexity management of just things emerging and not trying to control. And like you said,
you can manage them. It's very important to understand this. I mean, some people use complexity as an excuse not to do anything. Yeah. And the Agile community are very prone to that. It's complex, so don't expect us to commit to deliveries. Well, actually, one of the ways you manage complexity is to commit to a delivery and find a way to do it, all right?
Yeah.
And actually, human beings are really good at this.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, if you give, I mean, I've done this all my life, right? You give a team a deadline, somewhere or other they magically achieve it. If you say use your best endeavors, somewhere or other you never get anything, right? Yeah. So human beings tend to be and that's for anything, all right? And I say one of the reasons Scrum was successful, it created shorter cycles. So there was more event-driven stress in the system, so you're more likely to get deliveries out of it. So I think, it is this concept of if the world is uncertain, you can't know the future, but you can know what direction you want to travel in. And I think that's the big switch which we're now starting to people, and COVID has helped that because nobody knows what's going to happen a week out.
Mm-hmm.
It was actually quite interesting. So a lot of this work came from work I did with Admiral John Poindexter when he was running DARPA programs. So I ran a big DARPA program for him with people at Melo Park and others on human sensor networks. Yeah. And and that was before 9/11. I was actually in Arlington the night before, flew out that night, picked up the news next day, and it was about 3 weeks before I knew my team was still alive. Because we'd been in that part which got hit, right? So either way, it then got interesting, and we then did this big retrospective with Clinton's Al-Qaeda team, which included some very senior, very well-known names, all right? Nice thing about the US system is all the previous politicians are available for research when the institution changes. And so we went through the 9/11 report and using Kinevin.
Mm-hmm.
And every time they went through it, they say, no, because we should have known that. So everything became complicated because they had the benefits of hindsight. And John and I and Laz were beginning to despair we'd ever get them anywhere. And then over lunch, it was when the Americans were hitting somewhere in Iraq, I can't remember, it was a major siege.
Mm-hmm.
Nobody knew what the hell would happen. They started to talk about it, and then they started to use Kinevin because they didn't know the future. And that was actually really important because after that, we realized with the benefit of hindsight, everybody will see causality.
Mm-hmm.
So you don't try and do a retrospective. And some of our work, for example, some of the software techniques we've been developing is to create real-time continuous retrospectives in Scrum rather than the one-time one.
Mm-hmm.
And again, that's this concept of componentization as you swap something out with something else. So you get rid of the retrospective at the end of a period. You move into continuous work recording, which generates retrospectives. Now, it's not that you always do that, but when you do it, it produces a different result.
Yeah. Great. Yeah, no, I mean, I think that going back to the combination and like understanding like the purpose, and even in Scrum, you know, the retrospective is a formal activity to inspect and adapt, right? You don't have to wait till the end to do that. So it's just doing that. What do you think? I want to maybe we have about 10 more minutes here, and I would like to get your thoughts on the link between lack of resilience and organizational failure. You asked this question, or what did you find as far as the link between lack of resilience and organizational failure?
Okay, so the more efficient you are as an organization, the more you're optimized for your known context. So if the context shifts, you're highly vulnerable. All right, so there's in two English words which are the same interesting in Scandinavian languages, but are different in English, which is efficiency and effectiveness. I mean, we have a saying in Wales, English is too good for the English, and we generally think most things are too good for them, right? But it's this hugely rich language. I mean, Shakespeare brought in 750 words from Welsh because he liked the sound of it, yeah? So you can be very, very subtle in English, and English was designed for ironic conversations, which is an unfair tactic against Americans in the main. But basically, if you want to be effective, you've got to be inefficient to a degree. And the way I normally illustrate this is the difference between a seawall and a salt marsh. So a seawall is highly efficient because you can drain the land on one side, you don't get leakage, you've got landform until it breaks. And then it would be better if the seawall hadn't been there in the first place. Yeah, a salt marsh is not as efficient because it uses some land badly, but it absorbs water, and even when it's saturated, it doesn't release it catastrophically. And and anti-fragile is just a subset of resilience for everybody, unless you're called the Taleb, at which point you have to create something unique every 3 years to sell a new book. The reality is systems that succeed by failure are a type of resilience system, and it's only one type, and it's a very dangerous type to emphasize. So the bones are actually are benefited by stress until they break, and then they never fully recover. So you've got to be careful on that, right? So one of the things we've been working on is how do you measure the necessary degree of inefficiency? Max Boisser and I did this. So how inefficient do you need to be in order to be resilient? Because you actually need surplus capacity in the system, and you need diversity in the system. And this was one of the big problems with education. So education became very specialized. And so we don't have many generalists left. Well, if you don't have any generalists left, how the hell do you synthesize things? And then people talked about T-shaped generalists. You've deep expertise in one field, but you've read a few books in other fields. That doesn't count, because you'll always privilege the field you're an expert in, right? Generalists know enough about multiple fields that they know when they don't know enough, and they know which experts to go and talk with, but they don't privilege one technique over another. And again, I think, it was quite interesting. I was one of these in IBM until when Lou Gersten was there. This was common. It went with Sam. There was almost like a competition between senior general managers, and these are really important. They're above VPs in IBM, right? These are like serious shit. Most of them have budgets. I mean, the one I worked for, his rounding error every quarter was $250,000. It was under $250,000. It got rounded down to zero, which is how it hit things, all right, including me. But there was like a competition between them as to who had the most dangerous maverick. Because it was almost like you could almost hear them at meetings saying, well, my maverick has upset a damn sight more people than your maverick's upset. And I've had 15 requests for him to be fired, where you've only had 2. This actually was a conversation. I overheard it once, and I was the one with 15. And it was quite interesting because they were holding people who thought differently. It was actually a status issue to do that, because it was an expression of confidence. Those were all eliminated when Sam came along. Everybody got eliminated who was different, because the assumption was everything could be planned in the center. And I still remember Sam at a session we had with him over at on the West Coast, And he said the ideal is that we actually have a computer program which takes my strategic intent and implements it without people getting in the way. And I said, well, where do you think people like you are going to come from in the future if you get rid of middle management? And he hadn't thought about that. He just really genuinely hadn't thought about that in terms of the way it worked. So either way, I've rambled around a bit, but
No,
key
it's,
principle you need, it's called, I call it requisite variety. And it should be one of the key performance indicators for any organization. And the level of requisite variety will vary according to context. So you may need to build networks into other institutions to give you the variety.
yeah, and that's also like, yeah, again, like you go back and it's really like this is all fundamentals of complexity management. I mean, it's not. And what do you think? Maybe as a last question, what do you think the Agile community, or in for any matter, like what do we need to do to get better understanding complexity management?
You all need to go on rehabilitation programs to stop yourself being obsessed with credentials. I mean, I've got 3 sets of letters I can put after my name. They all came out of years of study from universities, and I never bothered to put them after my name. Agile people like to string 15 qualifications based on turning up to a 2-day course and filling out a multi-choice questionnaire with an open book exam, right? So you really need to break that, because it's a completely false representation of knowledge, right? I think the most important thing is to break away from the vendor-specific linear frameworks, which actually aren't frameworks, yeah? Scrum isn't a framework, whatever they want to call it. It's a collection of methods, yeah? And it works for certain types of software development, and it works for certain types of programs in HR or finance, but it doesn't work for strategy. It's a really bad method for handling strategy because it's too structured, right? So you need to have different methods and different combinations of methods from multiple vendors working in parallel, which is why things like SAFe, to a lesser extent, less ironically, right?
Yeah.
And I would have said until PMI got involved that was probably even better, but PMI will structure things, right? You need to get away from these highly structured single vendor solutions. Yeah, because they're actually really dangerous. And it's, I mean, final story on this, I was lucky, I taught leadership with Peter Drucker. So the first time I spoke on the same platform as Peter Drucker, which was at the Hotel Del in Coronado, which is one of my favorite hotels in the world, right? So I'm speaking before Peter Drucker, so I think this is wonderful. And I did a savage, naive attack on Taylorism. And I got the, not I knew Frederick Taylor, but I knew people who knew Frederick Taylor's speech, like that famous put down of the American vice president. And if you've ever been rendered into a puddle of humiliation by a 96-year-old genius when you thought you were going to be accoladed, you know how I felt, right? Either way, he decided I was retrievable and took me out for dinner. And then we actually taught 3 major courses together. Wow. Which saved my bacon one day because Lou Gerstner got an invitation to come to a exact invitation-only seminar run by Peter Drucker and Dave Snowden. And he wrote a post-it note, he told me afterwards, which said, "Who is this person? I gather he works for me." And that happened about half an hour before 2 people came in with manufactured evidence to have me fired. So that was really lucky because it kind of like went the other way. But one of the things Drucker and I agreed is that scientific management and complexity theory have a lot in common. Far more than they've got in common with systems thinking. Because both of them automate what they can automate. But they actually have apprentice models of management and they respect human judgment. And what happened with systems thinking is an attempt to remove human judgment from the system completely. Because it was all meant to be an engineered algorithm or a control mechanism. HR departments moved from supporting managers making decisions to producing spreadsheets about what salaries they could give people.